let's go on. And we're not yet finished with the efforts that are undertaken to address the climate crisis, but we're done with the political efforts. Yeah. What I have here for you, and I'll tell you, until a year ago when I gave similar lectures, I didn't have this slide. And I'm so proud to have this slide. The question that is behind this slide is, are there other international obligations, international law obligations, other than the ones that we find under the Paris Agreement, to address the climate crisis? And there have been some very inventive lawyers and often very young lawyers, students almost, yeah, that have started a number of initiatives to challenge before international courts, and the international courts have both been regional international and international global, to challenge the absence of action by their governments to address the climate crisis. And the first one that I would like to refer to is it's a judgment by the European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg, April 2024, so this is very recent, in which Switzerland was found to be in breach of the European Convention on Human Rights by failing to implement sufficient measures to combat climate change. And the rulings of the European Court of Human Rights are binding on its member states and are taken very serious. So now, the Swiss government is really in a bind. Does the Swiss government do so much less than other European governments? No, no. But there was this initiative by a Swiss NGO to bring this case, and now there's a ruling against. And all other European states are paying attention, because the same obligations, the same treaty, Human Rights Convention, applies to them. I'm sparing you the details, because this is actually human rights law, but it's a very interesting development. Then we have, it came out shortly after, a month later, in May 2024, there was the advisory opinion of the International Tribunal on the Law of the Sea, based in Hamburg. And this was an advisory opinion that was requested by the Commission of Small Island States on Climate Change and International Law. And this is not a very big organization. This is a small NGO run by very young people. And they asked, because this is possible, before ITLOS, they asked for an advisory opinion. And in December 2022. And in May 2024, they got their advisory opinion. And to some extent, it was beyond expectation. What ITLOS, which is an international tribunal that perhaps many of you had not heard of before, they're actually, they haven't been too busy. They're in existence since 1996. And when I talk about WTO dispute settlement, I often make a comparison against how much work the WTO dispute settlement has done and how little actually ITLOS has done, while ITLOS has a customs-built courthouse in a very nice location in Hamburg. It's a bit of jealousy on my part, because the WTO, the appellate body, never had its own courthouse. That's a footnote to a footnote. But when they came out with that advisory opinion, my estimation for that tribunal went up like this. Yeah. What they said was the following, that there is an obligation under the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. There is an obligation to take all necessary measures to prevent, reduce, or control marine pollution, yes, of course, this is not law to see, marine pollution from greenhouse gas emissions. An obligation to take all necessary measures. All necessary measures. And not only within your own jurisdiction, but also beyond your own jurisdiction. That's a very important point. And you have to assist developing countries in addressing these problems with marine pollution as a result of greenhouse gases. And I think I should be careful here, because here I'm treading in the domain of a scientist, but greenhouse gases and the marine environment, greenhouse gases make the water acid. There's a verb for that, or which I try to pronounce, but they make it acid. And then what's in there doesn't survive or doesn't flourish, dies out. It's a real problem. You'd say, well, there's water and there's air, and there's too much carbon in the air. But of course, the oceans also absorb the carbon. They're sinks of carbon. They take in too much, they die out. Okay. So the developing countries have to be assisted in their efforts to address this problem. And it's not only that you have to take action to prevent it from getting worse. Members are under an obligation to take action to restore what has already been damaged. So there's a restoration, restoring the marine habitat and ecosystems where the marine environment has been degraded. Now, there's much more in this advisory opinion. There's a lot of, for example, on the concept of due diligence, which is worth, for lawyers, worth to study. But I'm just picking out the most important things. Many countries are a party to the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. So this is of interest, of importance to all of us, including India. And then there are two proceedings that are currently pending. One before the Inter-American Court on Human Rights. So this is at the request of Chile and Colombia. It's pending, so we'll see what comes out. And both countries are asking for a clarification of the obligations to address the climate crisis under now the Inter-American Convention on Human Rights. And the one that you will probably have been informed of through the media, because it has attracted a lot of attention, is the pending advisory opinion proceedings before the International Court of Justice. At the request of the General Assembly of the UN in March 2023, the International Court of Justice is now looking into international law, including, obviously, and perhaps primarily customary international law, so not treaty law, but customary international law, to see whether there are obligations to ensure the protection of the climate system from greenhouse gas emissions. And, importantly, what are the legal consequences for states that do not live up to these obligations? What are the legal consequences where states, by their acts or omissions, have caused significant harm to the climate system? Now, we don't know how this is coming out. They had, and this is why I say that some of you may have been aware of this, They have had the hearings. They were televised, and they're still on the internet. You can listen to many, many, many interventions, interveners that have made their positions known. I have not, and should have, do my homework on this, listen to what India had to say. But you may want to do that. You may want to have a look at the statement that was made on behalf of the state of India. The interventions that I saw, that I followed, were a bit predictable. Of course, the NGOs that were given the right to speak were very forceful, and so all sorts of obligations in international law. All the states and state representatives were very sort of careful. Oh yes, we should do this and should do that, but it's not really an obligation under the law except for treaty obligations. So everything that is there in terms of obligation is in the Paris Agreement. Doesn't go further. That's the position of most of the governments. We'll see where that comes out. National Court of Justice is not known to be a revolutionary court, but neither was ITLOS. Yeah, so who knows? But the difference, of course, between ITLOS and the International Court of Justice, ITLOS had the Convention on the Law of the Sea to fall back on, and they interpreted an existing convention. But the best part, what the International Court of Justice is looking at is customary international law, which, as most of you will know, it's much more difficult to. What is a rule? What is not a rule? That's where the problem already starts. All right. Now, it's time that I go, because according to the official clock, I only have 35 minutes left in this lecture. It's time that I move to trade, and link trade with the climate crisis. And the first question that I predicted, I told you that I would ask, is, does international trade cause the climate crisis? Well, yes. Unfortunately, I feel a bit bad when I say that, because yes, of course it does. Yeah, because trade means transportation means greenhouse gas emissions. Okay. This is now, and one could say that about 30% of the global greenhouse gas emissions, especially carbon emissions, are the result of transport/trade. So trade is actually, in that sense, an important contributor to the climate crisis. But it is oh, thank you, that's most kind. It is also a contributor in another way. And here I'm going back to you, Jet. Trade allows the production to relocate. Yeah? Without trade, you would not be able to relocate. Actually, what is produced in India stays in India. Yeah? But trade allows to relocate. You can produce somewhere else than to sell it here. And how is that related to the climate crisis? As you indicated, it allows producers to move their production, which may be highly polluting, from countries where there are high climate ambitions and high strict regulation on, for example, carbon emission, to move it to a country where they have no or low climate policy ambitions. And that, of course, that replaces the problem, and actually often makes it worse, because you go from a country with some limitations on carbon emissions to countries with no, or to the extent that on paper they exist, they're not really enforced. And mind you, I do understand why there are no limitations in those other countries, or why they're not enforced. They're desperate for development, for employment. But this is also what trade allows you to do. You can move your production to places where you will be able to pollute. Now, I said I would also look at it in the other way. Does climate change affect international trade? And here again, yes, it definitely does, because climate crisis, climate change has caused productivity losses, has caused supply shortages, has caused transport disruptions. And I'm making a point here that I've made already before. How much this happens, how much impact it has, how much impact the climate crisis has on trade, varies from country to country, from region to region. Island states disappear. They're under sea level. LDCs, desertification. And it also differs from sector to sector of the economy. Some sectors are much more sensitive than others. Agriculture, tourism, and you can think of a number of others. Yeah. Now, what an impact that climate change has on international trade is also that climate change results in shifts of competitive advantage. Think back of wine growing in the north of Europe, north of the Netherlands, which probably means that some of the very southern parts of Europe will become too hot for wine. So production will shift from one region to another. And with it, of course, trade will shift. So, and yeah, now you may think, well, yes, but wine, yeah, wine. But no, think about rice, think of wheat, think of corn. All these crops are more or less temperature and water availability sensitive. So to the extent that the climate changes, that the weather changes, also the ability to produce it in that certain. And I was just now focusing on food products and agricultural products, but you can apply that also in other sectors, that competitive advantage will change over the world. And that, of course, will affect trade patterns. Now, I had a negative thing to say, I had a negative thing to say. Let's see whether I can get the classroom more positively minded. Again, by asking the question, can trade help to mitigate the climate crisis? Or should we all now sit back and say, yeah, can't do anything, everything will go back bad. No, I think indeed trade is part of the problem, but it can be part of the solution. And I'm not saying that because I used to be paid by the World Trade Organization. I truly believe in it, and I believe in it because of the facts, the reasoning that is behind it. What is the reasoning behind this? The reasoning behind this is that, first of all, trade facilitates the development of, access to, and the deployment of products, services, and technologies that are are there that help us to mitigate the climate change or to adapt to climate change. Without trade, these products, these services, these technologies would not be available, or they would be available at a much higher price, but often they would not even be available. And you would have to cope with your own locally developed technologies, your own locally developed products. A very good example of this are solar panels. Both the European Union and the United States used to have their own solar panel industry. Now, there's still some left of that, but if you now go to the shop in Europe, I can't talk about the United States, I've never done that, but in Europe, if you go to the shop, solar panels are from where? From China. Yeah? And they're high quality and they're cheap. So trade allows us access to technology, products that we desperately need in order to fight the climate crisis. If we want to go away from using fossil fuels and want to use the sun as a source of energy, we need solar panels, and we need them as cheap as possible. Now, we could have continued producing our own solar panels. Yes, we could. But these were much more expensive than the Chinese were. Okay. And I've got colleagues that say, yes, but the Chinese subsidize all this. That's a different discussion. In this discussion, I say, who cares? Yeah. Who cares that paying for my cheap solar panels? I need them. Same discussion with electrical vehicles. We'll come back to that when we talk about the IRA case. What else do we have? International trade and climate. Yes, trade, but this is a classical argument. But an argument you should not be overlooked. You should not be overlooked. You should not overlook, sorry. Trade creates additional economic growth. Yeah. And that additional economic growth creates financial resources that would otherwise not be there. And these financial resources can then be invested in addressing the climate crisis. So without economic growth, you have more limited means to address the climate crisis. And then finally, it's a bit more dramatic, but true nevertheless. Well, definitely true. Trade also gives us access to essential goods and services like food and medicines needed to cope with or to recover from extreme weather situations. Yeah. So it's then that you desperately need trade because now we need international cooperation. And the reason why we need international cooperation is as simple as a number of many of the things that I've been saying today. Yeah. Just to fill the time. Questions, comments, disagreements. That's boring if you all agree. You deny climate change.
Well, I agree that trade could be useful for dealing with the effects of climate change. Do you think the way that trade law is structured right now is conducive to that, or do you think it would actually hinder kind of movement that, the benefits?
Excellent question. No. I mean, the trade law rule that will bring us some way to that, to making trade useful, but not far enough. What the rules already currently do, I should stay here. I should not come to you because I'm the camera. I've been told to. discipline myself, not walk into the classroom. And what the rules currently already do is to keep trade free flowing, or relatively free and flowing. Yeah, and that's important because we need trade. So, for example, you can't have customs duties above binding. You can't have quantitative restrictions unless you invoke the exceptions. It does that, but when it fails, where it dramatically fails, is in allowing for enough policy space to take measures unilateral measures to combat climate change, or combat the climate crisis. And we'll see that again and again when we look at our case studies. Yeah. Most blatant lack is within our WTO subsidy rules, is the possibility to have a category of non-actionable subsidies that are clearly focused on supporting activities, subsidizing activities that are there to address the climate crisis. As I will tell you tomorrow, the appellate body, I was not on the division that decided this case. I still regret that. But I think they did the right thing. My friend and former colleague from India, Ambassador Bossche, was on that division, so he can talk. Well, we can't talk about what happened in the deliberation, but anyway, I was on the exchange of views. The division had to bend backwards in order to allow subsidies in that context not to be subsidies that were covered by the subsidies agreement. Yeah, that was an economist told us that's pure nonsense. Yeah. From an economic perspective, well, I'll talk about that tomorrow. But no, that's a clear example of where we need different rules on subsidies. We probably may also need other rules on the field of TBT. Okay, we're back in business. All right. So, a global problem requiring international cooperation on all fronts, including trade. Yeah? And then to ensure, I think I already said that, but I like to say it, to make sure that trade is more part of the solution than part of the problem. It definitely is part of the problem. I mean, let's not deny this. It is part of the problem, but it can be part of the solution, as I tried already to make sure. But you need more international cooperation on this. Now, there is a need for that cooperation, also because national climate change policies may well lead to trade disputes. And in order to avoid these trade disputes, you need international cooperation. Let me give 2 reasons why this is so. Why national climate change policies are, in the current state of affairs, likely to lead to trade disputes. First, because they differ and the level of ambition differs, they lead to what we call carbon leakage. It's what you already described. So a polluting company, industry, will move to a country with lesser, and they produce the product there. But what do they do with that product? They consume it domestically, partly, yes, but they also export it again to the market where they could no longer be producing. Now, some of the producers may not have moved, and they are confronted with higher production costs because they need to take care of the environmental standards that are not. So the products that come in from the countries that have low climate change policy ambitions, these products are much cheaper. They compete against the products of the regional market, and that's one thing that you call carbon leakage. The other form of carbon leakage is that you still have your products that are expensive because you have to produce them with high environmental standards. And you have this other country that does not meet. Now, a third country market, on that country market, you're competed out of that market because they all are importing from the other sources. So, carbon leakage, what do you do in the response to carbon leakage? And that's the whole CBAM story. Huh? What do you do in the EU CBAM story? What do you do in response of this carbon leakage? Well, you impose some sort of trade restrictions, be it in the form of a financial barrier, by imposing a duty or a tax on these products that come in from elsewhere, or blatant restrictions. So, no, we don't want them anymore at all, or limited quantities only. And that creates, of course, disputes. Another thing, and we were just talking about subsidies, but many climate change policies rely on subsidization of the domestic industry. Well, when you start subsidizing your domestic industry, countries that do not subsidize their domestic industry to the same extent will, of course, complain about that. And the rules do not allow us to. So, this leads to trade disputes. Now, what we have already seen at a regional level, we have already seen regional trade agreements to address the climate crisis explicitly in provisions. Yeah? So 20% of the regional trade agreements that are currently out there, actually we're talking to the ones that were notified to the WTO, 20% of them contain a climate change related provision. Often they don't go very, very far, but I'm just making the point that at least 20% recognizes this in the regional trade agreement. There's a very recent one last year that is very interesting and goes very far. And that is that it's an agreement on climate change, trade and sustainability between Costa Rica, Iceland, New Zealand, and Switzerland. These four. And they have the very first legally binding trade agreement that primarily pursues climate change policy objectives. So yes, it's a trade agreement, but it's a binding trade agreement, but its first objective is not to liberalize trade. No, its first objective, its prime objective, is to pursue climate change policy objectives. It's a novelty. Yeah? Will this be copied elsewhere between others? The three of the four are rich developed countries, up to very rich developing countries, about the richest developed countries you could find. And Costa Rica is a very progressive and relatively rich developing country. Yeah. It's very progressive. They're really pushing the agenda on environmental issues. So perhaps this is an example for, I still have to study the details of that agreement. It's too recent, but I think it deserves really our attention. Now, so at the regional level, things are happening, not a lot, but things are happening. The question is, and this is where today's lecture stops, but not this morning's lecture stops. Question is, what happens at the multilateral level? What happens WTO? What I will do with you this afternoon, I'll take your questions if there are any, we still have some time left. This doesn't happen very often to me. I'm just getting better in old age. I'm famous for going overtime. And brace yourself, we will go overtime in some of the other lectures. But what we'll do this afternoon is talk about the WTO. Yeah? And there I will first say a number of general things about the WTO, because, okay, we've said a number of general things about climate change and what it was and where it comes from and what has been done outside the trade field. This afternoon, we're going to look at the other dimension, the WTO. Of course, we'll put that in the climate. We look at the climate dimensions, but we will talk more in general about the WTO, where that stands at the moment, which is just to prepare you mentally for the lecture. It's perhaps not as bad as you might think. With that, I conclude for this morning, unless there are questions. Yes, there's a question.
Sir, can you give topics that arise from the subsidized?
Yes, oh, well, we will be big time. When at the end of this course, you'll say, and we will be looking at several of the cases in which subsidization was first. We'll be looking at, that's the first case we'll talk about tomorrow. We'll be looking at the Canada renewable energy case, subsidization case. Then we will go to the India solar cells case, and whereas we will be primarily talking about the local content requirement. That local content requirement was also within a subsidization program, which was of less importance in the case anymore, because actually the panel body has ruled on that dimension. But yes, that was also. Then we will just going through my mind to see whether there is any case that we're going to talk about that is not dealing with subsidization. Okay, the palm oil case, no. Palm oil case doesn't have a subsidization element to the extent that we're talking about the EU measures in that case. There was a French measure that was also, which we're not going to talk about, but in that case, there was also a French measure challenged, and that measure was challenged under the subsidies agreement. In addition to the GATT was also challenged in the subsidies agreement. We're not going to talk about that, so that's perhaps useful to know that there is a subsidies element. The IRA, US IRA, Inflation Reduction Act, is only subsidies. Oh, yes. Yes, and this gives me the opportunity to say something that I think is in your syllabus, or at least in the flyer for the conference. It also says that we were going to talk about the US renewable energy case, which indeed I intended to do initially, but then seeing all the material I had on the others, I decided not to do that. Why would have been nice? I'll mention the case. This was a case that India brought against the United States. So the United States brought the India solar cells case, and India retaliated. I wouldn't say that with an Italian official in the room, but really that's what they did. So, how dare you challenge our... you do the same, but not the same, but I mean, you're also guilty of a violation. And so they brought the US renewable energy case. Yeah, but we will not go into the details of that one.
I was wondering, you discussed the concept of common but differentiated responsibility. Yeah. I was thinking, to what extent can we integrate that in the interpretation of Article 20 exception?
Oh, that's one of my favorite topics. I will be speaking this afternoon. No, this afternoon, perhaps not. Otherwise, on the last day, I'll be speaking. Last day, I'll be speaking on a report of an expert group that I was part of, international expert group on climate crisis and both international climate regime law and WTO law. And what this expert group eventually did, it came up with a list of principles that countries have to take into account when they design and implement trade-related climate measures. And the principles that we identified, that we think are principles of international law, that you find both in the climate regime law, primarily in the Paris Agreement, but also find in WTO law. Those principles include, among others, common but differentiated responsibility. The European Union, particularly the ambassador of the European Union in Geneva, somehow got hold of a draft of our work, of our report. And he captured me in the atrium of the WTO building, and he said, I'm going to buy you a coffee. And if an European ambassador says that, and you don't say, no, sir, I've got other things to do. So I let him buy me a coffee. And he said, Peter, don't ask me how I know this, but in this report, draft report that you are also working on, you're claiming that CDBR is a principle of international law and is also to be found back in WTO law. We cannot agree with this. Sir, I'm sorry, but this is neither here nor there, whether the European Union can agree with it or not. And I cannot tell you what is in the report. This is still a confidential document. But honestly, I mean, we'll see how the reasoning comes out. Yeah, but I think that he said, I think that you're behind this. I said, I'm not. But yes. The final wording in the report is a bit weaker than I would have wished, but have to compromise. And the reason is as follows. Under Article 20, you have to, a measure is already GATT inconsistent, because otherwise you don't get to Article 20, because Article 20 justifies otherwise GATT inconsistent measures. So the measure is GATT inconsistent, you try to justify it. Go to Article 20, and we'll see that in one of the lectures, you go to Article 20b or Article 20g, and actually the European Union is very keen on going to Article 120a. They say that climate change is a public moral concern of European citizens, and now assuming for a moment that you come to the conclusion that the measure is provisionally justified because it is necessary for the protection of the environment or it is related to the conservation of exhaustible natural resources, assume that we have provisional justification. You then come to the application of the chapeau, conditions of the chapeau. The chapeau tells you that this provisionally justified measure may not be applied in a manner that constitutes arbitrary or unjustifiable discrimination. Now, how has arbitrary discrimination been defined by the appellate body? In the US shrimp case, that's late 90s already. In the US shrimp case, the appellate body said that there is arbitrary discrimination when, and I'm paraphrasing here, when a measure is applied in disregard of the local conditions that you find in the country that is affected. Yeah. In that context, it was the U.S. shrimp case was a shrimp that involved a case that involved India. India and three others. India all of a sudden found that its shrimp was no longer welcome in the United States. Why? Because it had not been fished by turtle exclusion devices. The appellate body, panel first, and the appellate body said, yes, okay, that this measure is related to the protection of sea turtles. But how has it been applied? And then India and others made the reasonable point that the United States applied this sea turtle exclusion measure, not sea turtle, exclusion of shrimp that was fished by method that was not protecting that shrimp that was fished in a way that harmed the sea turtles, that measure in itself was okay, but then it was applied on India, Pakistan, Malaysia, and Thailand in a way that was arbitrary because it did not take into account the fact that, first of all, India had its own ways of protecting sea turtles. Secondly, and that's always what I took from the case, that India fishermen harvest shrimp, fish shrimp in parts of the ocean where you don't have sea turtles. You don't have sea turtles. Yeah. So how does all that relate? Yeah. Now, of course, this was very, very specific in that case. But the line of reasoning is that you have arbitrary application of a provisionally justified measure when you don't take into account the local conditions of the country that. And that is why did the European Union react like this? Because this is potentially killing for seabed. So yes, and how do I relate this back with common but differentiated responsibility? Yes, there is common responsibility, but the responsibility is differentiated according to your capabilities. You have to take, if a unilateral measure is taken, you have to take into account the abilities that the other country have to actually do something, or the situations they face themselves. So, yeah, it's a bit softened in the final report, but it's still there. Yeah.
Stretch to ask for higher duties on industries from European Union, right? Even if you want to levy a duty for environmental purpose, levy a higher duty on your domestic industries, because historically, most of the European countries were our colonizers, contributed more in damaging the environment. So a percentage of duty can it be using common but differentiated responsibility?
Are you talking about customs duties?
Any sort of an duty that is levied based for environmental reasons, can we argue that a higher duty should be levied on them?
Well, that goes back to the discussion of whether there's discrimination, and whether this discrimination goes back to the question of whether the products are like.
Where same conditions prevail among countries.
Yeah. Basing yourself on that part of the sentence, yes. Yeah, that's something that you could do. Yeah.
Would countries welcome it? Theoretically possible. Is it something practically feasible?
You'd have to try it. Because with the exception of the there's one case, and I'll give you the reference later on. There's one case in which the appellate body really already digged into same conditions phrase, yeah. But there's only one case. But yeah, I think there's room for that. Oh, your next advice to the government. Good. All right. Yes.
I think that is to do with protocol and this Paris Agreement. So it says that the countries or if nations also have resources to support industries that help mitigate climate change. Then financial assistance should be provided to those particular industries or nations.
Yeah.
I mean, when I read about this, I was thinking that maybe the subsidies agreement at this point conflicts with this, not necessarily, not like essentially, but to one extent conflicts with this maybe.
Oh yeah. Yeah. No, obviously. I mean, if the government gives to one company, or to one industry, or even a collection of industries, if it gives cheap loans or even donations, grants of money, that would amount to a subsidy. Yeah? And since I said that the subsidy only went to one company or to one industry or a few industries, but it's not a subsidy that goes through the whole, like, to everybody. You have a specific subsidy. And then the question is whether is it a prohibited subsidy? Because it's an export subsidy. It's contingent upon export performance. If that is the case, definitely that's prohibited. Is it an import substitution subsidy? Or is it an actionable subsidy? An actual subsidy, you would have to examine the adverse effects that the subsidy has on interests of other WTO members. It's popular adverse effect to show is serious prejudice. And in many cases, that will indeed be possible to show. So, and that's the last sentence, which is an important sentence. The subsidies agreement now does not have a sort of Article 20 justification possibility, where you would say, okay, this is a subsidy that we should not have, but we justify it because it's really necessary to have that subsidy to fight climate change. You don't have that. Yeah, and we used to have a category of non-actionable subsidies, which was in the regional agreement, but it was a section that was subject on renewal. It had to be reconfirmed within 5 years of the existence of the agreement, and members could not reach consensus on the continuation of the section on non-actionable subsidies, which now people say, oh, well, that's extremely regrettable. To be fair, it would not have solved the current problems, because the kind of environmental subsidies that is non-actionable is, you can read it up. You'll see that they're narrowly defined. They would not have allowed sort of the big scale climate change policy subsidies that we currently have on the table. So, yeah, but it is something that one, the problem with creating exceptions is always the abuse of it, because many of these subsidies is the intention really environmental, or is it to give your industry a competitive advantage over? And yeah, so this is the real problem. But we've been able to, under the GATT, we've been able to handle this more or less under Article 20. So there should be no reason why you cannot handle it under the subsidies agreement too. Right. I don't want to run off before time is up.
Yes.